This week's podcast is brought to you by Percussive, the purveyors of audio cubes, the engine and remote system, as well as the upcoming SSP super signal processor for the Euro Reakt systems. Thanks a lot to Percussive for their support of the podcast. With that, Michael Hetrick. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to talk to Michael Hetrick. If you don't know Michael's name, you should. If you do a little search, you're going to find out that you probably knew about his work all along and you just didn't know his name was attached to it. Rather than me talking about it, let's say hi to Michael and then have him kind of tell us a little bit about what he's doing. Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Great. Darwin, how are you today?
I'm all right. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. I suspect you're a busy guy, so I feel pretty lucky that you were able to wedge me into your time.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Yeah,
cool.
We're just working on all sorts of new things this week, and a lot that I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. Why don't we start off by having you just give a quick tour of duty of the kind of stuff that you've been working on.
Sure, yes. My main project is my company, Unfiltered Audio. We sell audio plugins through Plugin Alliance. I run that company with my business partner, Joshua Dickinson, and we write VSTs, audio units, and AAX plugins. I also am an educator. I teach a modular synthesis course about once a year at UC Santa Barbara, where I graduated. And I write a lot of modular packages for software environments. So I created EuroMax for Maximus P, Euro Reakt for Reaktor, and recently I started HetrickCV for VCVRack.
Oh, wow, that's really exciting. VCVRack is like blowing up on my Facebook and email feeds, man. Everybody's talking about it.
Yeah, it's like each week I see another 1,000 likes on their Facebook page.
I know he really hit the nerve endings on that one, I think.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I'm very grateful that he's open sourced the entire thing and provided an easy SDK to work with, because I can just crank out modules for this, and it's wonderful to work with.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I'm a little bit curious about your business. First of all, you're doing plugin systems. Now you're selling them through Plugin Alliance. Why did you decide to work with them?
So we started the company in about 2012 as grad students, and we were initially selling rack extensions for Reason. And we wrote our first VST. It was called a G8, and it was a dynamic gate with all sorts of features where you could trigger the envelope manually from MIDI, or trigger other instruments using a MIDI output from the gate. And we were approached by Matt, the CEO of Plugin Alliance, initially at AES one year. I was presenting G8 as part of the student showcase, and that caught their attention. And then we spoke with them at NAMM a few months later after we released the first version of Sandman. And as students, we were spread quite thin between our studies and our research. So they presented us the offer where, if we sold plugins through them, they would provide us with a tech support backend, a quality assurance team, marketing, and all sorts of promotions. And for us, just starting out in the industry, it's been incredibly helpful just to focus on research and development.
Sure, that's actually a really compelling story, knowing being in the software industry and knowing what effort it takes to do the support and sales functions. That's got to be really keen. Now, you say you actually started doing this company and doing this work as a student?
Yes, yeah. So I started the company with Joshua Dickinson and Ryan McGee, both of whom were students at the Media Arts and Technology Department at UC Santa Barbara. And all three of us were working on our masters at the time. It was around the time that Propeller had released the rack extension format. We were taking DSP classes and we wanted to release some ideas. And we saw this new format and we thought it would be a great way to break in, just be one of the first companies selling on this new thing. So we kind of hastily put together a rack extension, tested it out, released it, and then we had a lot of fun doing it. So we kept on going. And yeah, it was just a great way to initially just make money on the side while we were students and help pay for our expenses. But it just kind of naturally turned into a full time job, and that's how I spend most of my time nowadays.
Shit, it's pretty interesting. Now, were you the stuff you did with EuroMax and the Euro Reakt for Reaktor? Was that
Yes.
stuff also things that you did while you were a student?
Yes, actually, both of them were student projects. EuroMax was one of my first projects as a student. I took a class under Matt Wright, one of the co-inventors of OSC, and he's the author of many of the Karma Max packages. And he's, just he's a great guy. So he taught a class. It was more about, it was sort of like an intro to DSP class. And the way that the classes were structured at MAT is on the first day of class, they would give you the final project.
Okay.
And so the final project for that class was, write a piece of software that demonstrates what you've learned. Um, like they're just very open ended because the department kind of combines, people whose backgrounds are pure art, pure engineering, pure architecture, and then combos of those. And so I came in as an artist with almost no programming experience. I had worked a little bit with processing and Reaktor, but I took like maybe one quarter of Java in undergrad, and that was about it. And so I was learning Max, and I decided everything that we learn in this class, I want to put into a Max object and just make it reusable, and that way I can see, is this working as DSP? Like, is this idea useful? And it was also at the time when I was starting to build a modular, and I clearly did not have enough money to build a modular as a grad student.
Right.
So it was kind of like a way to put some of that energy into like intellectual capital, I suppose, instead of just buying a module. Like if I saw something that I wanted, but I didn't have enough, I would say, okay, can I make something similar in Max? And that was how EuroMax started. Now, Euro Reakt was a few years later, and that was actually all part of my dissertation for my PhD. What happened was I was starting to teach a modular synthesis course with Curtis Rhodes, who was my primary advisor. And while I was teaching the class, that one of the huge problems was always we had, two synthesizers, one large one in the studio, and then like a Pittsburgh foundation that was kind of being passed around with the students. The modulars were already out of reach for myself, who, I've dedicated a significant portion of the last decade to modulars, let alone students who just have a passing interest. So when Reaktor 6 came out with this blocks format, I immediately knew, like, okay, this is, $99 for students. The sound quality is excellent. If I can port some of the ideas from EuroMax and document this thoroughly, I think this would be, a great platform for my students to learn. And so that ended up being my dissertation project. I bundled my dissertation with Euro Reakt. So if you download it from the user library, you can read everything I wrote there.
Wow. Cool. That's pretty exciting, but it also kind of really points to the fact, and now you're doing plugins, but you're also doing this stuff for VCVRack.
Yes.
You kind of live a modular life, I would say.
Yes.
what
Yeah, very much so.
what was your first interaction with it? Was it at Santa Barbara,
No,
or was it before that?
it was my senior year at Vanderbilt. I was wrapping up my undergrad, and I stupidly bought this issue of Sound on Sound that was about modular synths.
Oh
I
yeah.
still have it somewhere, but it was like a 2005, early 2006 issue. And so I started going on the forums around that time. Someone was selling a Dope for Beauty case for 20 bucks, and then someone else was selling a Dope for A127 triple bandpass filter. I forget the proper name for it. But at the time, I was primarily playing guitar. So I looked at this and I thought, okay, I'll use this as a glorified effects pedal. Just one module, one case, that's it. um,
Sure, that's how everybody starts, right?
you go in thinking like, oh yeah, I'm not going to have one of those crazy systems, and I look to my right and I have 7 rows right now of Euro Rack.
That's hilarious. Well, you actually are do recordings, and you're a performing artist too, right?
Yes, yeah, I perform under the name the February Thaw, and I try to focus on purely live performances, not like live in person, but live in the studio. I try not to do edits to my music. I try to create pieces that are more like gestures. Like I'll sit in front of my synth and I'll design a patch, and then I just try to do one take and leave it as that. I just kind of find it to be the most interesting way to create with the modular, just to treat it like I would treat, a guitar or any other instrument.
Sure. The the question I have though then, since you're so heavily invested in software,
Yes.
do you hybridize your system? Do you have like cables snaking back and forth to your computer, or do you kind of delineate between the two environments?
Yeah, what's funny is they're mutually exclusive. I have an Expert Sleepers ES8, which I use during academic presentations to show how to connect Reaktor to hardware synths. But in practice, in my own music, I just find it a lot easier to shut down the computer at the end of the day and just walk over to the modular and record there. And if I am doing editing, I'll record, bring it to the computer, and work on that separately. Occasionally, I'll generate material and save it to an SD card and use it as sort of like a baseline to work from on the modular. But I've almost never used both simultaneously, I should say.
Interesting. But when you're working with the February Thought, do you ever do then things that are in the box, or do you really prefer working in the hardware?
I think the last piece I published that was in the box was maybe uh, 2010,
Uh,
2009 or so. Yeah, it was one of my student projects. Satellites for Curtis Rhodes was a piece that I made for his composition class, and even then, it was a lot of modular material that was then heavily edited in the box.
right. Interesting. You mentioned Curtis Rhodes there, and I think a lot of people would be curious about what it's like, taking, first of all, taking classes from him, but then later on actually teaching with him. I mean, he's sort of like one of these people that's kind of a living legend,
Yeah,
right? How
yeah.
uh, how intimidating is that when all of a sudden you're like teaching a class with him, or even you're
Uh,
attending a class with him?
Yeah, extraordinarily, I would say. I mean, the first time I came across his material was I bought the computer music tutorial when I was in eighth grade,
Right.
or I got it as a Christmas present. And at the time, I was just starting to experiment with, at the time, it was called Fruity Loops. This was before FL Studio. And I saw this book on Amazon, and I was just like, oh, this will be great. I can finally learn all this stuff. And I got this copy, and I was so confused. I was like flipping through this book. I was like, this is all stuff from the 70s and 80s. Boo. And I just kind of put it aside, and it just I was just kind of a stupid kid. And then a few years later, I came back to it, and I realized what an excellent resource it was. It's just teaching me the history of all these instruments, and even though like it seems out of date, everything is still so relevant. Like the pictures are old, the descriptions are old, but FM synthesis is still the same, granular synthesis is still the same, additive, subtractive, all of this stuff. So having this book kind of laid a lot of groundwork for how I was independently studying towards the end of high school and most of college when I was, just building reactor instruments or trying to figure out how these things worked. Towards the end of my undergraduate career, I was trying to figure out what to do. And there was a Create Digital Music article about Curtis Rhodes, and it posted, he is a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And it was like this instant click where I was like, I got to go study with him. So I filled out the applications. I got in, and I think I embarrassed myself because on the first day I walked up to him and I was like, I want you to be my advisor. And there was this kind of like this long pause, and he looked at me, he's like, okay. And so that was how I met him. But over those few years, it was just like I took every class he offered. I worked as his TA a few times, and we would just go to Hollister Brewery in Santa Barbara all the time and just talk. music technology, and modulars. And that just kind of, I now consider him like a really good friend and mentor. And it was a huge honor working with him.
Sure, I'll bet. It's amazing. So I am a little curious because now you've kind of sprinkled like little hints about your background throughout the discussion so far.
Okay.
But I'm curious because I mean, right now you are an accomplished DSP programmer. You know, you're a performing musician that has a very specific kind of voice. So it's not just a fun thing. It's a serious thing for you. But you also, you know, you have this educational side to you. I'm curious about your background. One of the things I like to do on my podcast is explore people's background. Where are you coming from? Did where growing up, how much interaction with music did you have versus interaction with technology, and and how did you become the artist and maker that you are now?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been into music from the start. I think my mom put me in violin classes when I was 3. It was funny. I guess I only pulled out the violin when she had guests over. Like I just wanted to be a performer, and then that kind of fell by the wayside. But around second grade, I just wanted a guitar, and I was just glued to the guitar for years, and that sort of became my identity through grade school. I was the guitar guy. I started playing drums in fourth grade, bass in sixth, and then it was just like I was always the nerd. But I got to high school, and I played drums in a band, and I was finally like kind of cool. Not
Right.
necessarily, but I at least was able to shake off like sort of the nerdy reputation. That was short lived. But so I spent all this time as a musician, and then in the background, I got into the electronics. And as I said, I was using FL Studio in grade school. What happened was around eighth grade, Radio had put out Kid A, and that just kind of kicked open the doors for me. Like I needed to listen to everything on Warp Records. Like I was reading all these interviews with them, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you should listen to Square Pusher and Aphex Twin and Autechre," and I did exactly that. And so I was just, that was when everything changed for me. When it was just like, okay, I want to do electronic music. What happened was I sort of lacked confidence to do programming because I didn't start with it right away. So throughout college, I was mainly taking music business classes, art classes, film studies. I was just kind of more into everything but programming, and I was just working in the background. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a musician. What happened was I just got to grad school, and I knew, I'm not going to be able to support myself if I'm just only doing music.
Right.
So that was where I started to learn how to program, and I immediately fell in love. It was something that came to me very naturally. I just started, devoting all of my evenings to it. Outside of homework, I was always starting projects. I released a few iOS apps as homework assignments. And it just got to the point where, every day, all day, I was doing electronic music and I was doing programming. The whole unfiltered audio thing just kind of happened naturally from that. It was like, well, I'm doing this anyways. Let's turn this into a job.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you kind of stumbled into it that way because the timing of this, you actually kind of came through your education life a little bit early for what now is the creative coding world, right? Now it
Right.
seems like if you're in art school or music school, you're going to get kind of like pushed towards doing some programming. But that
Yes.
until very recently, that really wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, absolutely. When in high school there were no classes for me to take on programming. The art department in undergrad, processing was just starting to take off.
Hmm.
So I taught myself processing, and I did that for credits as like an independent study, but there wasn't really like a formal art technology class, I should
Yeah,
say.
that really wasn't part of the canon at all. Yeah.
Yeah. I did take a video art class, and that was the closest thing to art technology, but that wasn't electronic music, but that was still like a very valuable class for me because that was where I learned a lot of history in digital media. But yeah, the whole time was just independent studies for music.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, you actually did some programming in visual stuff too, right?
Yes, yeah. So on my portfolio page, I still have one of my video art projects. which was a video sculpture. And then when I was at MIT, I definitely continued taking generative visual classes. So I've posted some source code and some sort of images that I created in these classes. And when I work as the February Thaw, I try to do all of the art myself, like all of the art you see on my SoundCloud page. Those are all things that I made to go along with the music.
Do you do anything where, like, you have either the music or your code sort of like informing one another with between visuals and sound, or do you keep those also kind of separated?
Yeah, again, so far those have been pretty separate projects. The one crossover I did was I did a project for one of the MAT end of year shows called Synthesizer. And it was this large, I think they had like 9 TVs set up in the lobby. It was a large video synthesizer where I wrote a complex algorithm that was constantly generating harmonic sine waves in the background, but it was silent. You know, you would never hear the audio that it was creating. Instead, you would only see these complex visuals that were generated from it. And that was a really fun project for me because it was sort of me bringing together these two worlds, right, and then hiding one of them. Just keeping that part to myself. But I think that was one of my most successful video projects, and I had a lot of fun doing that. I would love to do more stuff like that in the future, but it's just kind of hard to find opportunities to do things like that.
My experience is that if you have both chops in audio and visuals, that there are so many people wanting to do music that are dying to find someone to do visuals that it's actually pretty easy to get gigs for that.
I'm constantly joking with my business partner, Josh. So he is way more talented than I am with visuals. He's incredible with OpenGL. And he does most of the visualizers for our plugins.
Okay.
Like the SpecOps visualizer that a lot of people love. That was all him. So we've frequently been talking about doing like a tour together. Like I'll do music, he'll do visuals, and we'll put something together. But right now we just have so many projects on our plate.
Yeah, I hear you. But on the other hand, don't make it too much of a joke. That sounds like that would be a pretty awesome experience.
Yeah, we would absolutely love to do that. Just kind of take a break from the serious programming and just release it into art.
Yeah, right, indeed. So now you said that as part of your background, you actually kind of learned all the pop instrumentation, guitar, drum, bass, all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
First of all, what of those things proved to be the most valuable to you in the music that you're making now? But also, how much of that ended up being valuable as you moved towards doing programming?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say guitar and drums were the two most valuable in many ways. Guitar, I'll start by saying, I think one of the things that is most important to me in electronic music, there's a thing that's kind of missing in a lot of modular music, in my opinion, and it's a lot of articulation. Like when I'm hearing a lot of recordings of, sort of smaller modular systems or people who are learning, there's this tendency of always keeping your envelopes and your VCAs just the same level for every hit. And that's one of those things that's so simple to get away from on an acoustic instrument. Like when you learn guitar, it's much harder to make everything the same amplitude than it is to just play in a flowier type of state. So one of the things I'm constantly trying to get away from in my music is I don't want that kind of machine gun nature in my music where each note is dot, 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 like right. Same articulation. And so that's one of those things I always keep in the back of my mind is how can I make this more organic, more natural? How can I make this sound more like an acoustic instrument? And I still think, the guitar is such a good controller in many ways. Like it's just a perfect interface. And that's one of those things that I'm always thinking about when I'm working with, say, pressure points or joysticks or whatever I have connected to my modulars. How can I rearrange this to be a natural fit for my hands? How can I learn these gestures and use them in my music? For drums, that's one of those things where when you're learning drums, it starts off, you learn basic 4/4, kick on every downbeat, and you start to break away from that more and more. So as you get better, you're learning how to not only play weird time signatures, but maybe a different time signature with each limb. And you start taking in a lot of rhythms of the world. So you'll learn, Brazilian drum styles. You learn New Orleans style linear drumming, and you just take in all these patterns, and then that translates really well when you're starting to program drum rhythms, because you have this sort of library of ideas that you get to work with. The other thing about that too is, kind of like the guitar and kind of like what I was talking about with modulars, is when I'm working with a drum machine, I can't use it if I don't have really in-depth velocity programming, because that's one of those things that I think I'll hear a drum pattern, and if it's just everything is the same volume over the course of the pattern, no matter how complex the rhythm is itself, it will just sound kind of bad.
It drives you nuts. Yeah. It's funny. I'm a big MPC user, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that drives me nutty is when I watch most people use it, the first thing they do is they hit the full level button so that
Right.
everything's at velocity 127, and they just kind of mash stuff out. And I'm just like, oh my God, there's so much opportunity for nuance and articulation here. And it's plowed over by pressing that one button.
Yeah, and it kind of goes hand in hand with like the loudness war that we have going on in recording, where it's just everything is maximum level all the time, and it's kind of exhausting to listen to. Like I want to hear more recordings where people are exploring dynamics and subtle shifts instead of everything being, mechanical and maximum volume.
Right. Well, and especially since we're not that dependent on blasting out of the radio anymore, you would think that that would kind of open up more freedom for dynamic exploration, but it seems
Yeah.
to not have really done that. It's kind of odd.
Yeah, on the bright side, I mean, I think that it's starting to break a little bit. Like, Spotify announced the newer standards. They're reducing kind of the dynamic levels. What is it called? It's a LUF is the unit
Yeah, right.
of loudness. So they're sort of fighting back, and I think things are changing. But there are still recordings I hear all the time where everything's just clipping. Everything looks like square waves.
Right. It's ridiculous. So, in talking about rhythms, one of the things I haven't seen in your work is a lot of work programming or developing rhythmic tooling. Is that
Yes.
something that you just avoid because you're not into it, or because it's too dependent on the hosting environment, or just hasn't come up yet?
really into it. I hide it. I try to make things that don't sound like they're very mechanically programmed, but in reality, there are a lot of deeper polyrhythms and all sorts of things happening. Like in my pieces, I tend to have like 4 or 5 sequences running at a time. It's just that I believe a lot in phasing and kind of hiding where a lot of these things are coming from. Like I don't want the grid to be audible in my pieces.
Sure.
One of the writings that actually meant a lot to me was in Curtis Rhodes's newest book. There's a chapter on rhythm, and he describes a state where instead of thinking about rhythm as a grid, he defines it as an ever-flowing substrate. That's something that's kind of stuck with me because when we're working with computers, we have the ability to put a sound anywhere. It doesn't have to be the downbeat. It doesn't have to be even like 16th notes, 32nd notes. We can place it anywhere we want. It's a matter of finding the tools that you can think in this state. But the modular is such an excellent tool for that because you have all these various clocks. You can choose to perform without a master clock. And I think that's, a very critical component of the music I make.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because one of the things about sort of like the grid, and whether it's computer or it's sequencing on a modular or whatever, I think that a lot of times people become dependent on the grid because it's sort of like a stress reducer, right? If
Yes.
you tighten things up to a grid, no one can point at you and say, "Oh, that guy doesn't have any time," right? Doesn't
Right.
have a sense of time. I popped in on your SoundCloud and I was listening to some of your stuff, and some of the things that you do are really interesting because they don't do grid-based time, but there are other, like, you used the word before, gestures. There are other gesture-like things that you do to sort of like say, well, this doesn't lay in a timeline, in a grid. but it still is composed of a timed environment. So you do things. I always like these things where, in fact, I just happened to be goofing around with this in Max the other day. The thing that kind of sounds like a ping pong ball bouncing, right, or something like that, right? You do kind of some of these physics-like things, and some of these other things. So what it does is it's able to say, I'm not on a grid, but I'm still being intentional, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What are some of the tricks you use to do that?
That's a great question. There are times where I will start a piece with just something looping over and over and over again, almost to the point where I'll get sick of it. But from there, I'll start to break it a bit. Like I'll find what would be a good example. Okay, so I was working on a piece with the Morphogene the other night, and that's a sample looper with granular capabilities. So what I've found is the slide control kind of picks a window of sound for you to work with, and the gene size kind of controls the size of the grains that are used to play back that section. So I'll find a way to modulate the slide parameter at exactly the length of the gene. So, you can plug in a clock out from the Morphogene, reset an LFO, and then just kind of have that LFO move the slide back and forth. So you get a very deterministic sample playback over and over, but there's now some modulation.
Right.
Then what I like to do is I introduce a completely unrelated modulation into either the Morphogene or the other LFO. And that's where you start to get this generative behavior, because you're saying, okay, here's my foundational clock, and here's the interruption that's going to throw the piece into a little bit of disarray, but it's still going to provide this foundational element that your ear will latch onto, and that, it will, as you said, communicate to the audience, I know what I'm doing, trust me. But, I don't want this to repeat over and over again as is.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
this dual LFO thing, though, that's a technique. You've got a pair of LFOs stuck inside the Sandman
Oh,
plugin
yes.
too, right?
Yes. Yeah. So Sandman, when I create plugins, I try to create tools that I would want to use. And one of my founding principles is I also like gear that is, I describe it as non-judgmental. So a piece of gear that I really fell in love with recently is the Octatrack. And I somehow resisted it for years, but I finally picked one up. And it is just such a bizarre design because there's no clear-cut way on how to use it. Like every time I power it up, I have a different workflow. And I think that's fabulous. Like I understand why it alienates so many people, but I love that you bring more to the table than what the gear does. So it doesn't sound like, you're creating demos of the gear you're using. It sounds like you're creating your music and you happen to be using this piece of gear. So with the effects that we've created, one of the things I try to avoid is I don't want it to have like a concrete workflow or sound signature where it's just like, oh yes, obvious use of Sandman.
Right.
And so Sandman was one of our first, I guess that was our breakout hit. And the idea was I just wanted a way to freeze audio and then use these unsynced LFOs to modify the position and the timing of the audio. So you get these repeated loops, but it's always just slightly off. It just kind of manipulates it. And then, we explored that in a much bigger way with Sandman Pro. So a lot of the presets that I included have sort of like a Steve Reich style where, one of them will freeze 10 seconds of audio, and the LFOs will modulate the playback rate on the left channel and the right channel ever so slightly. So you just trap a loop and you just, you get 10 minutes of material as the audio goes in and out of phase with each other. And yeah, that's just what I shoot for, is I just want people to use our tools. So Sandman, I knew it was going to be a success. I sent it to Steve Westbrook. He performs under the name Ignatius. He makes excellent music. He sent me an Instagram video, and I was so confused because I was listening to it. I was like, that's not Sandman. And he showed me how he was using it, and I realized that it was exactly what I was going for. It was this thing that whoever used it would bring themselves to the instrument, and it was not how I was using it, and that was what made me really happy.
Yeah, I actually wanted to explore that a little bit because it does seem like you're trying to make these unopinionated systems. And so the
Yes.
likelihood is when you actually get customers to use them, you're going to be a little surprised at what even comes out of it.
Absolutely. Yes. I think SpecOps, our most recent product, was kind of the most shocking in that regard because we've sent it to, very different artists. Like we sent it to Richard Devine and Sarah Chai. We sent it to Patton and Deru and, just all these artists who are coming from completely different places. Recently, there was a YouTube video. The guy is like Lisa's MMT8 is what he posts under. And he did a demo of vocals and only vocals, and he just used the same loop for the entire 18-minute video. And it was funny. Josh sent me this video, and he goes, "This guy knows how to use SpecOps better than I do." And I was watching the video, and I was like, "Oh my god, I think he knows it even more than I do." I wrote the DSP for it, I designed it, and then this guy is killing it, and it's just like, wow, I never thought to use it in that way. That was, I think, one of my favorite things I've seen so far as a tool creator.
For somebody who heard your story and was inspired by it, or sees your work as either unfiltered, or sees the work that you're putting into VCVRack, or was inspired by the Euro Reakt stuff, and says, "I want to be like this guy." Obviously they don't have to go through as much pain as you did because there's a lot more information out there. But
Right.
what would you suggest? Where would you point people who wanted to follow that path?
Yeah, a few things I'd like to address. One of those things is information was very scarce when I was starting. Everyone was trying to be sort of mysterious with their workflows, and there wasn't a lot of public sharing going on. So I think we're already in like a sort of better learning environment for people who are getting into electronic music. My advice, there are so many good books. The audio programming book is a great place to start. Reading up on your history through, the Curtis Rhodes books or whatnot. Reading the Super Collider source code, C-Sound source code, all of these are great resources. But really, part of my advice is the mental game. Just keeping yourself focused on what you want to learn and not feeling like you have to, live up to some standard. Like one of my big problems, and I still go through this, is, when I got to grad school, I had imposter syndrome in the worst way. Because, I'm coming in as a musician and I'm working under all these people who've contributed amazing things to electronic music. And I play guitar.
Right.
We still have this. Josh and I were talking right before Zip was released to our beta testers. He did months and months of research on the compression algorithm for that. And, we were nervous before we sent it into Plugin Alliance because they have many compressors, many of them are analog modeled. And it's one of those things where even though we're fairly confident in the product, there is just this, oh, well, everyone has these years of experience with analog modeling and creating Mojo and all these marketing terms. And when it comes down to it, it's just like, is the tool good? Is the thing you made useful? Start simple. Learn Reaktor, learn Maximus P, create a simple application that solves one minor problem, and then just keep on working from there. And, soon enough, you just get comfortable just through practice like anything else.
And how important do you think it is to just literally get work out there? Because, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about your history is that you did stuff like the EuroMax thing, and you just threw it out there for people to use, right?
Yeah.
I mean, did you get a lot of attention because of that?
So EuroMax was funny because I got almost no feedback from that. That was just one of those things where it was released, and I think a few MAT students used it, but I was mostly just using it for my own purposes, and I just open sourced it because it's Max, everything's open source. Euro Reakt, I did not expect for that to blow up in the way it did. I think that it was just a matter of good timing. But I do try to put stuff out as soon as I make it, just so I can start iterating. So with Euro Reakt, before it was Euro Reakt, I released the first module for it was Logic Mix, and I posted that the night Reaktor 6 came out. Like I bought it I started hacking at it. I watched one of the salamander anagram videos, and I was like, okay, let's make a block. And I wanted to post it immediately because I was proud, and I also wanted someone to say, here's what you're doing wrong. And then I made another block and another, and then I realized, okay, this is a pain for people to download. And then so I bundled it, and that was where it started to get out of hand. But yeah, I think it's really important that you put your stuff out there, because if you're obsessed with this idea of creating like the one great work, like this huge tool that will change music, or the album, which is still the thing that I have trouble with.
Yeah.
It's not going to get finished. Like if you don't practice the art of releasing things, like there are two things. Like it's hard to start things, but it's also very hard to finish things. And it's something you need to practice like anything else. So if you don't know when to say this is ready for people to use, that's just something that you have to work on over and over again. Yeah, for me, it's just I'll put things out. Sometimes it shouldn't have been put out at that state, but it's good to say, okay, here's a point where you can now use it.
So our time is just about up. I can't believe it. It's burned through that right quickly. But before I let you go, I'm just wondering, what are the things, another thing that's maybe sort of like a hallmark of your career or your time is sort of like the surprising events, right? Going from one thing. What's the next surprise that you're going to release on the world, man?
So we're working on the first unfiltered audio synthesizer, and this has just been, this is what we are deep into right now. We're currently just in a foundational state, but we're starting with microtonal support and MPE support because we want it to be flexible for everyone's purposes. So I have, the world's most boring sine wave generator, but I have it connected to a Rolly C board. And, I called my wife over the other day. I was like, take a look at this. And I dragged my finger across the keyboard and it went whoop. Yeah. And she was like, that's nice, hon. But we're just really putting a lot of effort into making this the best instrument that we can. It has our full modulation system, and the modulation system can exist for each note, which I think is going to be really exciting for a lot of people. And we're hoping to put it out in the middle of next year. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's our next. I guess it's not a surprise anymore, but that's what we're working on, and it's something we're very proud of already.
That sounds really exciting. Well, and I'm excited to hear about more stuff that's going to be embracing MPE in a creative way. I think that's really a strong contender for the thing that we're going to eventually say, man, I don't know how we got along without that,
Yeah, it's an excellent format. It's just something that I think every new instrument should support from now on.
Yeah, it seems like it. Well, Michael, I want to thank you so much for your time. It was great having a chat.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me.
But with that, I'm going to let you go and have the rest of your day. So thank you so much, and we'll catch you again soon.
All right, thank you so much, Darwin. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Bye now.
Bye.
Wasn't that amazing? Yeah, he's an incredible cat doing some incredible work. If you get a chance, check out some of his plugins or his work with VCVRack. It's amazing stuff. Thank you so much, listeners, for continuing to support me, for spreading the word. If there's any ideas, comments, suggestions that you have, shoot me a line, ddg@cycling74.com. Again, I want to thank Percussa for their support of this week's podcast, and thank them for the great work that they're doing as well. With that, I'm going to let you go. Catch you next week. Bye.